We are living in an American culture that has shifted from tolerant to cancel culture, from supportive to disruptive, from decent to rude, from optimistic to cynical, and from relatively safe to increasingly violent. Many are willing to exchange their liberty for a form of socialism. Through this podcast, we will chart a course to get America back on track.
Hi, I am Barry Farah, daughter of Barry Farah. My dad's a best-selling author, CEO across 6 industries, and former candidate for governor of Colorado. He is also a private pilot, adventurer, and engaging life coach. I should know. Through Culture Shift, my dad will systematically deliver a fresh and compelling path that will help you create your own American dream.
Welcome back to the Barry Farah Show, Culture Shift. Great to have you today. Today, we're going to look at a current attempt to sanction or in some form silence 2 senators in light of the concept of a memory hole. Now, as we mentioned last time, George Orwell wrote a novel about how bad a society can get when it adds technology to a totalitarian structure. So he wrote that novel in 1949. And the novel's called simply 1984. So he was sort of projecting out, what if we had a whole bunch of technology to Stalinist Russia, was really what he was thinking through when he was coming up with his terms that he used in the novel. One of those terms was a memory hole. It's the attempt to deliberately alter or make disappear any inconvenient or embarrassing documents, photographs, transcripts, or other records. Today, that expands to all things digital. So the goal of creating a memory hole is to give the impression that something never happened. In the book 1984, the government got rid of all the embarrassing historical documents that allowed them to, in effect, rewrite all of history to match the state propaganda. In 1984, the memory hole is this little small chute, and it leads to a large incinerator used to burn everything up that they don't want. 1984's protagonist is called Winston Smith, and he works in the Ministry of Truth, which is really about lies. And he's routinely assigned the task of revising old newspaper articles in order to serve the propaganda interests of the government. For example, Smith was called to retroactively change a statement about food rationing to reflect new policies. But to make the memory hole work, where you really get rid of the past and change history, eventually you're going to have to torture or otherwise penalize the stalwart holdouts that have the audacity to not only think for themselves, but hold to what is actually true about what happened in history. Now let's fast forward to recent events. On November 3rd, 2020, we had an election, and there were numerous claims of election dishonesty. But the mainstream media, out the gate, before they had looked at any evidence, said that those claims of dishonesty were bogus. Over time, those claims became more credible. There were more independent studies from a wide variety of people. Ultimately, the claims were so severe that a claim was brought to the Supreme Court of the United States to give them a chance to allow the claims to be made known public, to be thoroughly vetted, and to go through some rendition of a trial, some kind of a process where there could be some validation or discrediting of these claims. The lower courts and the Supreme Court punted on that. They decided not to engage, and they said that they didn't have standing. So we're going to leave it to you legislators or whoever else would have the jurisdiction, but we're not going to play. So the only thing left from a constitutional standpoint after that December 14th certification was the January 6th option to object, if you're a senator and a House rep, to certain state electors. So let's move forward to after the fallout of the Capitol debacle. So we are looking at 7 Democrat senators right now who want to punish Senator Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley. What's their crime? Their crime is in lending credibility and weight to the allegations of election dishonesty on January 6th. So in their words, while it was within the senators' rights to object to the electors, the conduct of the senators, Cruz and Hawley and potentially others, went beyond that. So what they're basically saying is that Both senators persisted in their objections after those threats came to fruition, and their actions lend credence to the insurrectionists' cause and set the stage for future violence, and both senators used their objections for political fundraising. Kind of funny on the last one. So first of all, the claims weren't baseless like they said. There are constitutional scholars that reflect that the claims have a solid foundation. At a minimum, the legal claims have a solid foundation. And I'll mention just a couple others in a few minutes. Second, who are these Democrats seeking sanctions against Cruz and Hawley? Whether Sheldon Whitehouse, Ron Wyden, Tina Smith, Richard Blumenthal, Mazi Hirono of Hawaii, Sherrod Brown, and Tim Kaine. Well, each one of these senators are known for having statements from the floor that are sometimes radical and in some cases very rude and disrespectful, but they're all protected by the Constitution. Third, how can Cruz and Hawley have anything to do with what's going on outside when they're debating the election dishonesty claims inside? And fourth, what does fundraising have to do with it? Everyone uses fundraising for everything, including the senators who have levied the claim. And finally, don't Cruz and Hawley have some kind of protection in the Constitution somewhere to do this? I mean, it seems like the 7 senators want a memory hole machine. They want to blot out the actual merits of the logic of the case for election dishonesty. As a reminder, prior to the Capitol debacle, 13 senators that were Republicans said they would oppose electors in up to 6 states. And in each of those states, there were 140 House reps who committed to do the same. Most often after the certification in December, the January, it's really just a ceremony in January. But if a senator joins in writing a House rep to object to those electors, then this joint session stops. The House and the Senate go to their respective chambers and they deliberate for a couple hours, 2 hours for each state. And then they vote on whether the electors submitted by the governor and secretary of state of that state should be disqualified or not. And this is all under the rules of the Electoral Count Act, which was passed in 1887. Now, if there was no Capitol debacle, I still don't think the debate would have changed the certification outcome. But I do agree that it would have changed the narrative of the day. And here's why. You can get an hour for each side of the political aisle to make your case on the validity of the vote in that state. Each state had between 6 and 11 independent claims of dishonesty. I'll give you an example in just a minute, in addition to the legal claims. The legal claims included both at the state constitutional level and at the federal constitutional level. And at the constitutional level, federally, one of those claims is that it has to be done on the same day for everyone clause. In other words, there is actually a clause in the United States Constitution that says the election for the President of the United States needs to happen on the same day. So, though it was very contentious, the 2 hours would have allowed the dishonesty claims to be heard in a peaceable manner. After the debate for each state, there's a vote in both the House and the Senate. That takes about 20 minutes or so. And so they all get back together in the joint session. And so even if the 13 senators and the 140 House Republicans voted for rejecting the certification in each instance, the motion would have probably failed. And then the vice president, who's the presiding officer, moves on to the next state. So the other states where there's no controversy just get certified fairly quickly. And then you come to the next state where there's an objection. And the joint session breaks up again, and that whole process repeats. So if all 6 states were debated, that would go on for approximately 15 hours if you include the votes. Now, it would have just delayed things, is what some say. If it wouldn't change the outcome, the question is, why do it? Well, we covered some of that in our discussion on a previous episode on the freedom right to petition government for redress of grievances. It's in the First Amendment. The bottom line is that it can help set the stage to correct things going forward, even if it doesn't fix this current election. And it allows a constitutionally protected way to bring legitimacy to the primary claims of election dishonesty. But we had a Capitol debacle. We had goofballs who were spontaneously caught up in the moment, foolishly colliding with paid instigators, we know now, that were planning the assault in advance. Had the disruption not occurred, the planned objection process would have continued. Most importantly, it would have given the petitioner, the one that's representing the grievance, a platform to work with from the power of a national stage. For example, Georgia has 11 dishonesty claims. One of those is that in Georgia, 66,247 voters were under the age of 18. Now, that's a no-brainer. I mean, you should have looked at that, and those votes are not legal, and they should be discarded. That'd be more than enough in Georgia to change the outcome. According to a white paper done by Navarro, when you tally up the voter dishonesty claims for each state, there are a potential of 254,000 dishonest votes in Arizona, 601,000 in Georgia, 446,000 in Michigan, 220,000 in Nevada, and 992,000 in Pennsylvania. So in each state, way more than enough to change the outcome. So if these allegations were true, one can certainly understand the desire on behalf of those who were grieved to bring the information to the table in a national forum. I mean, the mainstream media doesn't want to hear it. They were out the gate saying, before we hear any evidence, we know that this is debunkable. And the Democrats certainly wanted not to have anything to do with opening up the airways for a methodical Cruz and Hawley combination, the senators, of litigating each of these claims. So they would do everything they could to keep that from happening. But Cruz and Hawley were engaging in their constitutional right to air their grievance on behalf of their constituents in accordance with 1887 law. So even though it was, from a legal standpoint, not an unusual thing for a Democrat and a Republican to be in disagreement on something, what's really unusual is these 7 Democrat senators want to sanction their 2 Republican peers for the process. I mean, for being engaged in it. And then why is that? It's the attempt to blot out the election dishonesty claims. They want to throw all the claims from hundreds now of independent sources, independent folks studying, and they want to throw those claims down the memory hole chute. They want to rewrite history. They want to make it seem like that never happened. That's why the big tech companies are trying to scrub all of this information about the election dishonesty claims. Now, let's just look at the issue at hand from a constitutional standpoint. Senators have a lot of latitude to say things. I mean, in fact, to prevent prosecutors and others from using the courts to intimidate a legislator just because they don't like what his or her views are, legislators are granted immunity from criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits for the things they say and the work they do as legislators. This is in Article 6 of the Constitution, Section 1, Part B. I mean, bottom line is, in addition to not being able to be arrested when you're going to and from your house based on what you're saying, for any speech or debate, they call it the speech or debate clause, in either house, they shall not be questioned in any other place. So it's set up, this part of the Constitution, precisely for this type of objection. If it's controversial, you're still well within your rights as a senator to speak your mind. The senators had a right to object. The Constitution protects them. Police can't arrest them on the way to or from work, or anything they say in the chambers is protected. The speech or the debate clause affords immunity from arrest to members of the Senate or the House, and for anything they say or do during a speech or preparing the speech or in the debate, anything that's in Congress while they're there in session. So this clause basically was an attempt to protect the legislature from the judicial and executive branch primarily, but it expanded. In one Supreme Court ruling, members of the House and their staff were protected even when the Congress disseminated students' privacy issues. I mean, the court held that the clause protects, and I quote, anything generally done in the business of the Congress, whether by a member or an aide. Before that, there was a very important SCOTUS case in 1966. The conclusion was that in order to enable and encourage a representative of the public to discharge his public trust, and I'm quoting, with firmness and success, it is indispensably necessary that he should enjoy the fullest liberty of speech, and that he should be protected from the resentment of everyone, however powerful, to whom the exercise of that liberty may offend. So this case, called the Johnson case, involved a former congressman who probably was guilty. He was indicted and convicted on 7 counts of violating a federal conflict of interest statute and on 1 count of conspiring to defraud the United States. The court ruled in his favor, though, by broadly interpreting the speech or debate clause. Kind of amazing. So it's argued in November of 1965. It's decided fairly quickly after that in February of 1966. They quote this Article 6, 1B clause: for any speech or debate in either house, they, the senators and reps, shall not be questioned in any other place. So this ruling came along with a little history lesson. In this speech and debate clause of the Constitution, this was approved at the Constitutional Convention without any opposition. Other articles were debated hotly and changed and modified, but this one just sailed right through. The founders knew the basis for it. There wasn't any disagreement on it, and it came from the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The freedom of speech there and the debate in Congress shall not be impeached or questioned in any court or place out of Congress. That's what it said there, so it's very similar to ours. And this all came from the King Charles I attempt to imprison members of the Commons back in 1629, and he called them seditious libelists. Yes, what was their crime? These legislators disagreed with King Charles, so he was wanting to put them in jail. And so in 1689, the English came out with their own Bill of Rights, and that allowed them protection. So this particular article was not controversial. It sailed right through, and it's because it gave the senators and the congressmen the freedom to speak freely and to engage in activities for their constituents. So back in 1966, that case, they were saying that it was undisputed that Johnson actually delivered the speech. They're not squabbling with that. It's undisputed that Johnson received the funds in question. But no one gets to decide if the speech was desirable, and it doesn't even matter who prepared the speech, and it doesn't make any difference what Johnson's motives were for making the speech. So what the SCOTUS was saying is the prosecution, coming in this case from the executive branch, violated the express language of the Constitution and the policies that underlie it. So what are the policies that underlie what the Constitution says? The claim of an unworthy purpose does not destroy the privilege. That's the policy. However reprehensible such conduct may be, we believe the speech or debate clause extends at least so far as to prevent it from being made the basis of a criminal charge against a member of Congress of conspiracy to defraud the United States by impeding the due discharge of the government functions. So what are they saying? That even if the congressman's conduct was improperly motivated, and even if the speech was coming from this bad motivation, the speech or debate clause doesn't allow for inquiry by either the executive or the judicial branch. So all Congress members are exempted from arrest or interrogation for any speech or debate entered into while they're in legislative session. So with that background, what are the 7 senators trying to accomplish? Now, this is a little different because it's among the members, and among the members, you can make rules of how you're going to punish your members. But those rules have to be made before you violate the rule. And there is no such rule that Cruz and Hawley violated by simply taking the 1887 law and applying it. In fact, in a 1987 case, this congressional immunity was found to be applied even more broadly to evidence or testimony about all acts that occur in the regular course of the legislative process. It therefore applies to activity taken in the course of even legislative fact-finding. So what happened here was really straightforward. I mean, Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri was the first senator to declare that he would object to the Biden electors. He would be the one to force the hearing of the objection during the joint session. He said he objected to the certification because some states, particularly Pennsylvania, failed to follow their own state election laws. And because of the unprecedented efforts of mega corporations, including Facebook and Twitter, to interfere in this election in support of Joe Biden. At the very least, Congress should investigate allegations of voter fraud and adopt measures to secure the integrity of our elections. That does not sound at all illegal. And guess what? It's not. What about Senator Cruz? What did he do that was so bad? So he follows up with a declaration to object, and he says, I'll bring not only myself, but a group of 11 senators with me. And Cruz advocated for an emergency 10-day audit of election returns in disputed states. Maybe you could call that a novel idea, but senators support all kinds of proposals. And there were others supporting this: Senator Marsha Blackburn, Mike Braun, Steve Daines, Ron Johnson, John Kennedy, James Langford, Bill Hagerty, Cynthia Lummis, Roger Marshall, and Tommy Tuberville of Alabama, a new senator. So So you've got 11 senators joining you, and here's what they declared. Here's what they wrote. Voter fraud has posed a persistent challenge in our elections, although its breadth and scope are disputed. By any measure, the allegations of fraud and irregularities in the 2020 election exceed any in our lifetimes. So, those senators simply wanted an electoral commission with full investigative authority to carry out a 10-day emergency audit of the November 3rd election results in the states where President Trump and his allies alleged fraud. So Cruz's point was pretty straightforward. 10 days is pretty close to inauguration because this happened on January 6th, where it was to happen on January 6th. The outcome of this investigation would put the nation more at ease, would be his argument. Agree or disagree with his idea here. It's not really a controversial request in the scheme of things, legally speaking. Legally speaking, it's in the middle of the bowling alley of a potential proposal that a senator could make. Senators make proposals all the time. So Senator Cruz and his 11 supporters were just wanting to use this joint session to make their case for the Electoral Commission and this study. But it would not have passed. If there was no debacle and if they had continued with all 6 states, they could have made their point. They could have peaceably made a petition for redress of grievances, and they would have been able to make their case. Now, after all of this was happening, right before the January 6th event, some folks believed that the vice president could intervene. I've looked at this and I've read a couple of different constitutional scholars, and not really. He was a presiding officer, not in the position of being a judge or even an activist judge. And I don't think the founders meant for one person to be able to make a decision that big. You might have missed this, but here's exactly what the vice president actually said. The vice president welcomes the efforts of members of the House and Senate to use the authority they have under the law to raise objections and bring forward evidence before the Congress and the American people on January 6th. So it was up to the Congress to take on the grievance. Now, at the end of the day, after all the debacle at the Capitol, only 4 senators joined Cruz and Hawley in voting against Arizona's electors. 7 others who had planned to vote no changed their minds after the riot. All but one had been part of the Cruz 11 that was unveiled a few days before. So after the riot and Congress reconvened, even Cruz and Hawley passed themselves on all the other states except for Pennsylvania. Hawley was kind of obliged to do something here. He gave kind of a weakened argument compared to what he had previously planned to do, but that was before the debacle, and so he's kind of catching his breath and giving an acknowledgement of the horribleness of the violence. So here we are at the end of this. What can be done at this juncture on the other side of this while we have 7 senators trying to say that Cruz and Hawley were wrong to make their claim? What they're really going after is they don't want you to know about the actual underlying logic of those claims. I'm hoping the senators will be strong and use this as an opportunity to make sure that the memory hole is not effective. Look, use the attack for a counterattack to refresh the memory. Make sure that what actually happened remains visible. Hey, I'm grateful you spent time with us today. We'll take a look at some other elements of crazy things going on in our nation at this time that I think are important to understand. But let's do the best we can to make sure that history is remembered accurately and not swept under the rug. That would be a bad thing for us to participate in the memory hole. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
Hi, I'm David Farah. Thank you for listening to my dad's podcast, The Barry Farah Show, Culture Shift. Click subscribe now to be sure you don't miss an episode. Share this podcast with your friends on social media and give The Barry Farah Show your 5-star rating. Check out today's show notes below this episode and at thebarryfarahshow.com. This podcast is also available in video format at The Barry Farah Show on YouTube. See you next time.